What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Iron Culture. It is me. I'm Eric Drexler here, alone once again. Helms did not bother to show up. As I understand it, still doing various travel activities relative to bodybuilding competition. I have not actually talked with Helms since his show, but my understanding via social media, unless he has concocted a narrative that is fundamentally untrue and gone to very great lengths to reiterate that. It appears that Helms had a top 5 finish at the WNBF Taiwan Pro Show, which, first of all, congrats to the good doctor, Eric Helms. Very awesome to be taking home a medal at a pro show. I saw pictures. He looked awesome. His competition looked awesome. So really, really good stuff there. My hope, this is what is not yet resolved. My hope and my prayer is that in addition to his medal, he will be given a very large novelty check. And on that large novelty check will be written an even larger sum of money. So I am not sure if that's the case, but if our next episode shows the two of us in a very elaborate studio with very clear technology upgrades, you can be assured that we had a giant windfall of cash due to this competition success, and that we reinvested all of it into building the official Iron Culture studio. So fingers crossed. I'm sure the audience shares that hope with me. So as long as Helms is able to bring home a very massive windfall of cash from his recent success, then we should be able to offer you a much higher quality product here at Iron Culture. Now, speaking of high quality products, folks, if you want to support our friends, listen, you're part of the Iron Culture. I get it. You have needs. Those needs are currently not being met. And that's because you need gear. You need lifting gear. You need lifting apparel. And what you have right now is letting you down in a big way. So if you want extremely high quality lifting gear and apparel, we're talking bands, wraps, straps, you name it. Excellent t-shirts that will catch attention, positive attention. Make sure you go to elitefts.com. That's Dave Tate's operation over there. First of all, enjoy their content, but when you're done enjoying their content, check out the shop, buy that high quality gear, and use our discount code, which is MRR10, that stands for Mass Research Review 10, so that you can get a discount, help our friends, help us, everybody wins, right? Speaking of supporting people, if you like the show, make sure that you do what you can to support it if you're into that kind of thing. So like, rate, subscribe, review, share it with a friend, tell everyone you know. And if you really love the show and you want to support it, always a good idea to check out the good old-fashioned Mass Research Review. Go over to massresearchreview.com. It's where we review the newest, most cutting-edge research every single month, whatever is new in exercise, nutrition, in all tangential related fields. We are bringing that to you the first of the month, every month, with written content, audio content, video content, keeping you on the cutting edge of what is new, relevant to your health, fitness, wellness, performance, physique, strength, etc. All right, folks, I am nothing if not a man of my word. Last episode, I promised, I made a commitment to you that the jazz music would be back, the full countdown. And indeed, it is back. So I'm a man with many flaws, too many to count, but I have delivered the jazz, and I've been told by many that that's the best part of the show. So I'm getting a lot of appreciation in the YouTube live chat over here, and I appreciate the appreciation. Now, here's the deal, folks. There are, let's see, aside from just absolute pandemonium, talking about the jazz music being back, every comment so far is about a recent dust-up in the evidence-based fitness world. So it makes sense to address that on the show tonight. It's kind of like what everybody's talking about in the evidence-based fitness space. So I will address it, but I'm going to zig where other people zag. Okay, so if you're not aware, there's a whole big dust-up in the fitness world. Basically, I'm going to mess up the names, and I'm not being dismissive here. famously do not consume much fitness content at all. So I'm going by the comments here on hoping I get everybody's names correct on this. So it sounds like a person named Solomon Nelson made a video about Mike Israetel, kind of going through his dissertation and, identifying a bunch of, things like, spelling errors, citation errors, errors in tables where standard deviations didn't really make sense. So things of that nature, but then also kind of offering broader commentary on whether or not, for example, the research was original enough to warrant passing. Was the research completed with adequate proficiency to warrant passing and ultimately awarding the PhD degree? Were there too many errors in it to justify awarding the PhD? So basically, I think it's like a over hour long initial video. And then Mike and Milo Wolf made a response video. And then there's all sorts of additional content and confusion and layers to it. And so just to kind of put my cards on the table, have I consumed all of it? No. Have I consumed much of it? Also no. I'm just generally aware of who are the characters, broadly what seem to be the claims. And as of the last time I checked in on it earlier today, I still didn't fully understand the situation and feel like I had enough information to chime in a meaningful way. Because, that's how you do it, whether you like it or not. I mean, one of the reasons that our show has painfully low listenership is that we are kind of that that general approach, which is let's not be first to levy an opinion. Let's wait, hear, people argue out the details of this and wait more and get all the information we need and then ultimately reach some kind of a conclusion. So if you came to Iron Culture, or specifically me, Eric Trexler, to get the hot gossip and, reckless speculation and immediate knee-jerk reactions, my first question would be, what are you doing here? That's never really been my thing. I don't really like to get into anything that's kind of inflammatory, gossipy, etc. And on the rare occasions that I do feel inclined to do that, I'm always the last to the topic because I want to take in all the information and make sure I fully understand all the details of what went down. So with that being said, without knowing all the details and having a lot of confidence in exactly what went down and when and why and how, that doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about this, but I generally, if you've followed my content for any amount of time, I much more prefer talking about ideas than people or personalities. And I much more prefer, when warranted, to talk about how to think about fitness content rather than what to think about fitness content. So with that being said, until I get more information, I'm not going to sit here and just say, this is exactly what happened. I'm assuming that this part of the story is not true. And this is the good person. This is the bad person. And instead of me just giving you all those kind of pre-digested conclusions while acknowledging I don't have all the information I would want, instead of doing that, I'm way more interested in talking about two main things in this podcast episode. And I think this one may end up being shorter, but usually when I say that before recording a podcast, that means it's going to be 15% longer than normal. So we'll see how it goes. I expect this will be a little shorter, but instead of diving into who did what, who said what, who's in the right, who's in the wrong, and then casting judgment on the whole situation, there may be a time and a place for that, but I just want more information and I want a minute to digest it and kind of really collect thoughts before I share them. I'm more interested in a pair of questions that I will address pretty thoroughly on this episode. Number one, what does your favorite evidence-based fitness professional's PhD really represent? And number two, if for some reason, somehow, your confidence in your favorite evidence-based fitness professional's PhD were rocked or threatened or challenged, how would that impact your view of their content or their advice? So the question really is, this PhD, this kind of indicator of authority that certainly does signal something to people in the fitness space. What does that actually really mean? What does that really represent? And what does that do to the way that we take in the information that's being presented by that person? So I wanted to take a minute as somebody, I do in fact have a PhD. So I'm one of those people who makes fitness content and has a PhD. And so I wanted to take a minute to kind of take people behind the scenes a little bit in terms of what this whole process looks like, what actually goes into it, what does it really mean, and more importantly, probably what does it not mean. And so my goal is that by the end of this episode, people will have perhaps a more measured, more nuanced perspective of how they view not just the PhD, but really any credential that is perceived to represent expertise in a particular area. Any kind of credential that leads someone to say, my views on this, my perspectives, my ideas should be given a heightened level of importance or consideration. So we're going to talk about where credentials come into play when we're interpreting content that's being made. So the first question is, what actually goes into a PhD, right? Because a lot of the stuff with Solomon and Mike is basically, it all comes down to a dissertation document, right? And so I think it's worthwhile to zoom out a little bit and discuss what actually goes into obtaining a PhD. Because if you look in most thesis and dissertation documents that I've ever reviewed or submitted, it may vary by institution, but usually the dissertation will say, like, this is a thesis project submitted in partial fulfillment of the degree blank, 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 whether it's a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation. And that's the terminology we use in America, is thesis for a master's, dissertation for a PhD. That does vary in other regions of the world because nothing can be simple. So first of all, what goes into a PhD? Number one, you got to get into a PhD program. Okay. So someone has to decide, okay, there are in many cases limited spots here. In some cases, they may be funded spots. So some person has decided, we're going to go ahead and at least let you into the program. Now, the barrier to entry for a PhD program can vary a lot. There are some PhD programs where, for example, there are very limited spots. They have a high rejection rate. If you get in, you will be fully funded when you're there, which means not only are you getting in, you're also essentially in a roundabout way getting like a fully paid scholarship or fellowship to pursue your entire PhD. So there are going to be some programs where just the admission part alone, if you get into that program, it really says a lot, at least about your competency leading into that program, whether you came in with a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. If it's a highly competitive program where people are really fighting over those spots and you get in, then it at least says something to the effect of you being a proficient student leading into that experience. Now, but like I said, just because someone has a PhD doesn't mean they went to that kind of program. It could be they went to a program that is, not particularly selective. Maybe they I've heard of some programs, they're less common in the sciences, but I've heard of some programs where you actually have to pay your way through it and pay out of pocket to do your PhD. I've always told people, at least in my field, never pay for a PhD. Simply do not do it. But they're in certain fields. Certainly there are programs out there where they'll basically say, hey, if you want to come do this and just keep paying tuition every semester, okay. Like, we don't have limited spots. You're paying out of pocket. We don't need to worry about, filling different assistantships or research positions. Like, you can just come and take classes and take tests and write a dissertation and then leave. So there's a lot of variation in terms of, is getting into a PhD program an indicator of extremely high aptitude and success or not? It really depends on the specifics of the program. Now, once you're in a program, what does a PhD entail? It's going to involve some advanced coursework. So in theory, this should be usually to get, if you're pursuing a PhD in a particular field, it is broadly assumed that you have already demonstrated mastery of the kind of undergraduate, if not master's level content within that field, or at least within the key prerequisite courses. So the idea with the PhD is that your coursework looks a little bit different than it would have looked when you were doing your undergraduate coursework. So you should be taking things with a much greater level of depth as you're getting into it. A lot of times the courses just feel different. A lot of times you're digging more into original research and doing more discussion and kind of higher level thinking about it, more so than just kind of, here's, how mitochondria function during exercise and then take a test on that. Usually it's digging into the original research and really kind of pushing into some more nuanced elements of the field. In addition to your advanced coursework, a PhD ought to certainly have some degree of research element to it. Generally speaking, you're going to do research to build skills, which lead into dissertation research, which in theory, the PhD is intended to be a doctor of philosophy. That's what the PH is for, is philosophy. And so the idea is when you finish a PhD, you should have the level of research, skill, and experience to say, I'm now someone who can generate new knowledge in this field. So basically, a vague way of putting this, and I'm sure purists will correct me very aggressively on this, but you could kind of think of it as like an undergraduate degree is, hey, you have demonstrated that you know the stuff in this field with a high level of proficiency. And then with a master's, a lot of times it's obviously mastery of that information. And you could also think of it as being, not only do I know the content, but I'm able to kind of synthesize that content into kind of little iterations and combinations of putting things together in a way that's more advanced than the kind of, we give you information, you give it back, associated with an undergraduate degree. And then with a PhD, it really is, in theory, more focused on the generation of new knowledge. So I understand not just the content in this field at a high level, but also the kind of philosophical, like philosophy of science, such that I can, produce new meaningful knowledge. And then finally, usually there's some element of either teaching experience or practical experience that's mixed in. So a lot of people during their PhD, they may teach a lot of courses. They may instead do some kind of assistantship as a coach. So there's different ways that you can do that, but there's usually some kind of teaching or practical element. So a lot of the questions that have been coming up lately as people have kind of commented on this whole situation is, first of all, who decides whether or not someone did a good enough job in their PhD? And that process is fairly straightforward. So you get into a program, which again is that first barrier to entry. At that point, as a student, you're going to form a committee of faculty members who are going to ultimately decide if the project you're proposing is appropriate, if it's adequate. They're going to assess your progress as you pursue that project, and then they're ultimately going to evaluate how you did as you defend your dissertation down the line. So a lot of different universities have all sorts of different requirements of who can be on your committee, who must be on your committee. Sometimes you have to have an external person who's from outside of your department or even outside of your university. I've seen a lot of research committees that are international in scope. So they all different universities have their own way of kind of dictating what the composition of that committee must be. But at the end of the day, that committee is who is essentially giving the student a series of red lights, green lights, or yellow lights along the way. And so a student, the committee, there will be a chair of that committee who's the student's main advisor. And I've heard of scenarios where a student gets into a PhD program and is just not doing well from like day one, and there's always some kind of background to it. It's rarely that they're just not intelligent people. It's usually that they just don't have the passion for it, or there's something going on in their life that's really detracting from them being able to kind of bring their full awareness and presence to what they're working on. More often than not, it usually has to do with stuff going on with family, stuff going on with mental health, stuff going on with physical health. There's often some kind of barrier where if you get into a PhD program and immediately things just are going really poorly, there's usually some kind of extenuating circumstance. But usually in those cases, the chair of the committee will pick up on that and start to say, hey, like, this might not be for you. You know, it may not be, maybe it's the right thing, but at the wrong time. There's all these things going on in life. Maybe you need to address those. Maybe it doesn't seem like your heart's in this research stuff, so maybe you should do a master's and then, move on to, starting a career rather than doing a more extended PhD. So there's, that whole kind of like first step is just getting into the program. You start your courses, you start some preliminary research. At that point, after you do that a little bit, you're going to get to the point of actually proposing a dissertation project. And so you're going to write up this big proposal, give it to your committee. They're going to read it over, kind of chew on it. They might grill you a little bit. Usually in departments I've been in, you have to actually kind of defend your proposal in a weird way. So defending it makes it sound like it's kind of final, but you basically write up your proposal, say, here's my research question, here's why it matters, here's how I'm going to do it. And the committee is basically supposed to determine at that stage, is this project worth doing? Are you really carving out a research question that is worth investigating and warrants, is appropriate at a PhD level? I've seen I've heard of some scenarios where a doc student gets to that proposal step and the committee says, this really, the way it's written, it looks a lot more like an undergraduate thesis or a master's thesis. And for you to do a PhD project, we need you to do more. We need you to go further. And it may be that you need to incorporate more lab skills. It may be that the scope of your question is too narrow. I wouldn't say too narrow, but just too small in impact. And maybe there's a way to address that in a more meaningful way. But anyway, it's the committee's job at that proposal stage to decide, assuming this person does everything right, proficiently, is this the kind of project that we would award a PhD for if it's executed well? And then, of course, the other side of that question, which the committee also is responsible for, is this even feasible? I have definitely heard of scenarios, especially at like a master's thesis level, where a student writes up a proposal, gives it to the committee, and the committee goes like, brother, it's going to take like $200,000 and like 9 years to do this study, and you have $15,000 in 2 years because it's a master's thesis. And actually, we're already 6 months into it. So you have a year and a half. And also, you have to like finish your data collection before you analyze and write it. So you have like 12 months basically to get this thing going if you start today. And also, where's the other like $185,000 coming from? So sometimes the committee has to kind of push you to make it bigger. Sometimes they have to push you to tighten it up and be a little bit more practical, focus more on feasibility. And so then after that, the doc student will do their thing. They will try to deliver on the project that they proposed, collect the data, analyze the data, write up the document, give it to the committee, go defend it to the committee, and the committee will ultimately decide, basically, did this student do a good enough job? And generally speaking, it's not to say that you cannot fail a dissertation defense. That's fundamentally not true. But there are so many barriers to entry and checkpoints along the way. It's highly unusual that a doctoral student will get to actually defending their dissertation, and then the committee just says, absolutely not, and don't try to fix it. Just no. You're just done. Usually when that happens, basically I've heard of scenarios where the dissertation project just falls apart and just doesn't materialize, right? So that person never gets to the defense. They propose, they start trying to do the study, the thing just falls apart. Again, there's usually some kind of extenuating circumstances there as well. Something in the family, mental health, physical health, where things just don't go well. And they say, I'm going to go ahead and bow out here. And there is something called ABD, which is like, I forget exactly what's all but dissertation, I think. But it basically means that I skipped a step. Usually before you do the dissertation, you take your comprehensive exams, which is literally just exams where you are demonstrating that you know all the PhD level knowledge you're supposed to know. So basically, you get into the program, You ultimately are going to learn a bunch of stuff, take comprehensive exams to show that you know what you did, you know what you're supposed to know, and you have the kind of knowledge base that would warrant awarding the PhD. And then the dissertation piece is off on the side. There's kind of these two different components. Did you learn and demonstrate knowledge of all the PhD level stuff? That's the comprehensive exam. And then also, did you go and do this project and execute on it? That's the dissertation side. So there are some cases where people will take all the classes, pass their comprehensive exams, maybe propose a dissertation, but then realize this dissertation is not going to happen. It's just never going to happen. And then they will take their ABD. So it basically is, instead of having a PhD on their resume, they just put ABD. And it means, hey, maybe I did a bachelor's and a master's. I worked on a PhD. I did every part of it except successfully defending a dissertation. So anyway, like I was saying, the process is on the research side, get in, start doing some research, propose a study, do the study, and then defend the dissertation. There are some rare instances. There's rare instances where the person proposes but never gets to the defense. There are some scenarios where somebody gets to the defense and they basically say like, okay, you did broadly what you said you were going to do, but maybe this document's a mess or your statistical analysis was wrong. I've actually heard of a situation where someone fundamentally misinterpreted their statistical output. Like they thought they were looking at these numbers, but they were actually looking at those numbers. And so literally their whole document, like 150-page document, was written based on things that are fundamentally not true. It was just like you were looking for numbers in this table, but they were actually in that table, and therefore every conclusion that you made is not just wrong, but complete nonsense. The numbers do not actually refer to what you think they refer to. So in those scenarios where it's like, okay, you did the project, the data exist, the data are usable, we just think your document's bad, or we just think your analysis needs major work. In many cases, they'll say like, well, why don't you like take this back and work on it, and we'll try to do this again. Or they might say, okay, you've passed in principle, but we're going to give you extensive notes, and you need to go revise this thing really heavily. So there are some situations where that kind of stuff occurs. So all that is to say, there's going to be multiple kind of check-ins and obstacles and barriers that you have to, or hurdles, I guess, that you have to clear along the way. And at the end of the PhD, if all goes well, basically what that means is you showed up, you usually spent somewhere in the ballpark of 4 to 6 years in this program. You did some teaching. Maybe you did, in our world, maybe some coaching along the way. But most importantly, you took a bunch of advanced level classes, you demonstrated, you got good enough grades in those classes, and then you took a big comprehensive exam over everything and demonstrated adequate knowledge on the comprehensive exams, and then you proposed, completed, and defended a dissertation project, producing a document that ultimately your committee decided was adequate for awarding the degree. So that's I mentioned 1,000 words ago, probably more than that. When a dissertation says completed in partial fulfillment of the degree, it's because there are those kind of other elements that go into it, especially the comprehensive exams being another major component. Now, when it comes to, you're into fitness and you want to get information from people who know their stuff. And so maybe you're getting information from people who say, hey, I have a bachelor's in exercise science, or I have a bachelor's in nutrition or biochemistry, or I have a master's in this, or I'm a doctor of physical therapy, or I have a PhD. It makes sense that people want to know, especially when there are contrasting or kind of conflicting opinions, what does this PhD actually represent? What does it mean? What separates the haves versus the have-nots in terms of the people with PhDs versus the people without them? And how do I kind of rank order that across all these other different dimensions and credentials when I'm trying to assess who might be a reliable source of information? And when you are viewing a person's credentials in that way, and in this case, I'll specifically talk about a PhD, it's very important to keep, in my opinion, 3 points in mind. Number one is that not all PhD programs have a similar focus. And what I mean by that is, especially in like exercise science, you're going to find some PhD programs, when you look at how they're built and what their graduates end up going and doing down the line, you find that they're very teaching oriented. You'll look at a department and say, you need to make sure, for example, let's say you want to go out and get a huge grant. We're talking several $100,000 for a grad student grant. Do you have grant administrators in your department and university who can literally administer that grant? There's a lot of stuff that goes into managing a large grant, especially if it comes from a federal source, because you have to do all the documentation and reporting and make sure you're not breaking any of the rules of what happens with federal grant money. So you could apply all you want for massive federal grants, but if you don't have the administrative infrastructure to actually deal with that, your university is going to be like, what do you want us to do with this thing? Or they may try to help you out with it, and it may be just an absolute nightmare. So there's a lot of departments where they say, listen, we just don't do a lot of this stuff. I've talked to people who were at smaller schools that did offer some PhDs, but every time they tried to run a supplement study, the IRB would push back big time. And we're talking about supplements with very well-known safety, but they would just say pretty much straight up, we don't have a medical school here. We don't do these kind of like biomedical, pharmaceutical type interventions. It's not what we do. And we don't want to take on the liability of getting into that business. And, my friend was like, dude, I'm like, we're talking about like creatine, I'm not giving them some like off label or like, some drug that's still pending approval by the FDA. This is like straightforward stuff. And they said, still, it's not what we do. So you're going to find some programs that are very teaching oriented. And even if you wanted to do like huge, ambitious research projects that were, I want to take muscle biopsies. Okay, with what equipment? How are you going to analyze it? If you don't have a, $250,000 wet lab set up to actually do the assays and the tissue samples that you want to do, you're not going to do them. Same thing. There's going to be, some departments that are very teaching oriented, some that are very focused on application. So you might, there are some select few programs in exercise science where they really, you spend a lot of time in the gym, a lot of time in the weight room, actually working with athletes, more so than being in what we would consider a kind of a standard biomedical lab type setting. So, there's some, relatively few, but there are some PhD programs that are heavily focused on application and saying you're going to be spending a lot of time working with athletes, and your job is to learn at an expert level how to make them bigger, stronger, faster. And then, of course, there are PhD programs that are very research oriented. And even within that, there are going to be programs that focus on different types of research and different scopes of research capability. So I've seen some very serious PhD programs, but then when you dig into but these are very serious research-oriented programs, one of which I actually considered applying to. But when I looked into it, basically all the research that was happening there was very epidemiological in nature. There were not a lot of like hands-on in the lab type studies that were going on. And that's the kind of research I wanted to do, was getting in the lab, rolling up my sleeves safely with a lab coat covering, and putting on the goggles and doing the work. And so I found some research-oriented departments that were very serious. They were all about research, and they had the infrastructure to do big time grants and things like that, but they were not set up for the kind of lab work that I wanted to do. And so what you have to figure out then is the main takeaway here is just not all PhD programs have a similar focus. So when someone says, I have a PhD in some field that is related to exercise, physiology, nutrition, believe me, that can look like a lot of different things. And it's not to say that one is better or worse than the other, but it's important to understand that, you are talking about fundamentally different experiences, which means that ultimately they may share the same credential on paper, but the scope of expertise, the area of expertise, the type of experience they have, the type of knowledge and skill set they built along the way looks fundamentally different at these different types of programs. So with that context in mind, it's kind of weird. I wouldn't say weird, but it's difficult to defend a perspective in which you're looking at the, three people with three PhDs in these exercise related or physiology related fields and saying, oh, so they all basically did the same thing for that 4 to 6 year period. That's not a safe assumption to make. And what you may find is, for what I'm interested in, this person over here did a lot of the stuff that makes sense for me to follow. This person over here, they earned their PhD and that's great. But maybe they did their PhD at an extremely teaching oriented department. And this person over here, I have a very nitty gritty research question about lab techniques that they actually used during their PhD. You start to see it's very clear that those two individuals are not equally capable of giving feedback on what you're looking for, or at least we would have to seriously doubt that they have equal credibility or perspectives on that specific topic. It doesn't mean that one's a dummy and one's smart. It means you have a very specific need, and these people had fundamentally different experiences and different skill sets that they built during their PhDs, even though on paper they both have a PhD in seemingly related fields. Important point number 2, which I think is obvious to everybody, when you're, and this isn't just about like the current dust up, but this is just broadly speaking in general, when you see two PhDs on Twitter yelling at each other, saying, you're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. Not all PhD programs have the same level of rigor. So certainly that can differ a lot from field to field. I can tell you with a great deal of certainty, listen, my PhD program, I'm happy with the selection. I thought I got really good training. I thought they pushed me in a way that was ultimately good for my development. That's great. It was not a cakewalk by any means. But even having said that, I can tell you that I, for example, collaborated with someone doing a PhD in physics. I've collaborated with mathematicians. Let me tell you, brother, a PhD in physics, a PhD in mathematics at a serious institution with really high expectations, I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. I mean, great if you can get it, but man, when I would talk to a peer of mine who entered their PhD program the same year I did at a fair, a pretty solid institution with a pretty good reputation, but I was working in my field. He was working on mathematics. Man, he would tell me just the vibes and just what that program was like and what the expectations were. And the number of people who were entering their 8th or 9th year of the PhD. And listen, you go from field to field, stuff gets a little different. Even within a field, when you compare this university to that university, there are going to be differences in just straight up, what are the expectations? What are the skills you're going to develop? Who are the people you're learning from? And at the end of the day, it's really important to recognize that a PhD program is more like an apprenticeship than it is going through an undergraduate degree. So you're going to have a small group of faculty that are going to be teaching you the finer points of becoming an academic in this field. And so, if you're working over here with these world-renowned experts who, have really high expectations and also have just insane levels of knowledge and experience, that's going to look very, very different than, a place, a different university with different faculty where people maybe don't have a similar level of achievement and maybe are just a little more lax. And they're like, yeah, it's no big deal, right? Do what you can and then get out of here in 5 years. So it's going to look very, very different in terms of the rigor, So it's really important to keep that in mind. And again, when you're looking at two people with PhDs arguing on the internet, you can't just say, well, it's a tie. They both have PhDs, so they're both equally credentialed and credible. You really have to dig into, okay, what were their PhDs in? What kind of program do they focus on? And how rigorous does it seem like that program might be? If I'm going to even bother trying to break it down to who has the upper hand in terms of who should have a more credible opinion. But that's not even necessarily a good indicator. But these are the things that come into play when you're saying, well, this person has a PhD. Well, what does that actually mean? It turns out it could mean a lot of things. Another important point, number 3 here, is that even from within the same exact PhD program, not all graduates are going to have the same level of talent, insight, or expertise. So a great example of this is look at any law school. Every year, especially at like pretty solid institutions, really highly rated law schools, they're going to crank out somebody at the top of the class who's going to go defend ultra high profile clients or work their way up to a step below the Supreme Court. Like these are people that are going to be getting the most desired positions in the legal field. And at that same exact year, that same exact law school is going to crank out someone at the bottom of the class who limps to the finish line, gets through, barely passes the bar exam, and ends up with just a fundamentally different career. And I know, listen, I get it. There's also people have connections. Maybe someone near the bottom of the class goes and works at, Uncle Ted's law firm and goes right to the top, but you get the idea, right? So it's not true to say that every person, even who came from the same program in the same field and even with the same primary advisor, it doesn't mean that they're all equally knowledgeable, skilled, talented, etc. So as I talk about these differences between PhD programs in terms of their focus, their rigor, even variation within a program in terms of just success, knowledge, intelligence, whatever, my goal is not to make you more obsessed with the credentials and saying, well, these two people are arguing, screw their arguments themselves. Instead of looking into the veracity of what they're saying, I'm going to now do a massive deep dive into exactly how they spent their PhD time. That's not what I'm advocating for. But what I am suggesting is that, right now with this whole dust up, there seems to be a lot of discussion about, what is a PhD, what goes into it, who gets one, what does it take to actually say that PhD is warranted, and therefore what is ultimately afforded to a person who has a PhD. At the end of the day, it's really important to recognize that having a PhD versus not having a PhD, when we're trying to evaluate the type of content a person's creating, we should not be viewing that as a binary indicator of success or knowledge or intelligence or expertise or anything of the sort. It is a very, very broad categorical element of what ultimately might contribute to a person's claim of having, some kind of expertise in an area. But at the end of the day, what a PhD actually means, we can view it in the broadest sense as something of a symbol, and that symbol does not necessarily mean I am, one of the smartest human beings that's ever walked the planet. It more so reflects what is this person committed to and what do they value, right? So a person with a PhD, probably the most accurate way to broadly summarize or generalize what that really means is, at the very least, I know that they have a high level of commitment to learning in the field that they chose for their PhD. It's a safe bet that they have some degree of value for scientific evidence and research, generally speaking. It'd be really painful to go through a PhD program and to not have any regard for the scientific method or the value of research. It may also signal in some cases that this is a person who thinks credentials are important, right? Those are, when you're looking at, someone has a PhD, what does that truly reflect about them? It means that they at least had the right combination of intelligence, aptitude, and grit to work their way all the way through the end of it. And they probably fall in at least one of those boxes, meaning they have a high level of personal commitment to learning, or they have a high level of value for scientific evidence and research, or they just thought getting the credential was very important. So that is my best effort of saying, what does a PhD actually represent or symbolize? At the end of the day, when we see that someone has a PhD, it means that the person who mentored them as a grad student, the chair of their dissertation committee, ultimately observed their work over years and decided that they were ready to leave the nest and take the title with them. So it wasn't time to boot them out the back door. They said, okay, I've been observing your work for years now. You passed your comprehensive exams, you passed all your classes. I'm satisfied with your dissertation work. You're ready to go. And ultimately, the chair of the dissertation committee certainly has to come to that conclusion, and then the committee itself has to vote in the affirmative for that conclusion. So when you're looking at someone else's achievements and whether or not they should have gotten a PhD, at the end of the day, usually the person who's more qualified to make that assessment is the one who's been observing their work day in and day out for years. And, if they've made that conclusion, I'm generally inclined to take their word for it. But that's just my perspective. If you feel differently, or if there's a particular advisor who you're like, well, I don't trust their word. I see who you did your PhD under, and I don't have any value for their assessment of your work because I don't like their work either. You're completely within your rights to make that determination. And my whole thing with this podcast is I have no interest in telling anyone what to think, but hopefully in providing more context so that they can develop their own opinions on, not just the current, dust up in fitness, but there's a lot of people out there who have a credential, create, evidence-based fitness content. And it's valuable to kind of think through very carefully with full visibility into the process. What do I actually take away from this credential, and how much do I feel it really bolsters their argument or their positioning within the space? So one other thing I'll mention is, if let's say that you're looking at somebody, you looked up who they did their PhD under, you say, I hold their advisor in very low regard and I do not respect their opinion whatsoever. At the end of the day, the academic world is essentially an industry where there's two kinds of currency. One is currency, money, and the other is reputation. And so you could identify little instances where people said, this grad student's a dud. I probably ought to just boot him out the back door and say, go away, but it'll be easier to just say, okay, let's let him limp along and finish this thing and get him a degree, right? But at the end of the day, neither academics, the advisors, nor institutions like to make a habit of granting PhDs to people who are blatantly unqualified. The reason being, it just makes everybody look bad and ultimately causes a lot of reputational harm if compounded with, doing it over and over and over. So a good way to think about that is like, if anyone's ever asked you to recommend them for a job, or imagine that your least reliable, most useless friend who you love dearly, but you know that they cannot be counted on for literally anything. Imagine that they asked you to recommend them for a job. And not only that, but the job they're asking for this recommendation for, the owner of that company is someone you very much care about, right? You certainly do not want to put this person in harm's way by recommending someone who's going to just tank their business. It also will reflect very poorly on you if you make a habit of just writing these blanket recommendation letters for people who are not qualified for the jobs that they're applying for, or just a terrible fit for these jobs. So at the end of the day, your reputation is a resource, whether you're a PhD advisor or a department or an institution, and you really don't want to get in the habit of tarnishing that reputation by sacrificing standards and awarding degrees to people who are just fundamentally not capable of representing your department well when they take that to their next position or take that forward in life. So those are all just things to keep in mind when you're looking at, what does a PhD mean and what does the route look like for people to get one. Now, I want to get away from the credentials and actually answer some questions that I think are much more important than credentials themselves. So a lot of times people who are consuming fitness content will look at a PhD and kind of use it as a mental shortcut and just say, without thinking too much about how they got that, best case scenario, worst case scenario of what that really represents about them and their skill set and their knowledge level. I'm just going to take a mental shortcut and say they've got the PhD, I'm satisfied, and it's just an on-off switch. You either have one or you don't. At the end of the day, we can probably do better by asking better questions. So the question generally that you're interested in is not, does this person have a PhD? You're really more concerned about more direct questions. So for example, how do we know if someone is an excellent researcher? There are people with PhDs who are excellent researchers. There are people with PhDs who aren't. And that doesn't mean that the people who aren't are bad at everything. It may just mean that they went to they did a PhD program that did not really focus all that much on research. Maybe it was more teaching oriented, more practically oriented. So the best sign that someone is an excellent researcher is not that they have a PhD necessarily. The best sign is that they've done a sufficiently high amount of nuanced research that is generally held in high regard by other subject matter experts. So a good indicator that you are an excellent researcher is that you do excellent research regularly, often, and your research is well received by the research community, people who are also equipped to evaluate that work. So in many cases, we need to just get straight to the point of what we're interested in, right? So if someone is saying, I am recommending this thing on the basis that I am an excellent researcher and therefore I'm qualified to do so, if them being an excellent researcher really sways your opinion about whether or not you're going to take their advice on that, well, the easiest way to look into that is look into their research record. Do they publish high quality research on a regular basis, right? Another thing, maybe the question is not, is this person themselves an excellent researcher, but how do we know if someone at least just knows their stuff about researcher, right? Because not every film critic was an award-winning film director, right? There are people who really devote a lot of time into learning how to evaluate and interpret research without doing a ton of it themselves. And so the best sign that someone knows their stuff about interpreting research is that they've done a sufficiently high amount of nuanced research evaluation, and that those evaluations they've done reflect, number one, a deep understanding of research, both in terms of the theoretical aspects and the practical aspects. And number two, this person's evaluations previously have ultimately produced a really good track record of being accurate, right? So when they call their shot and say, this is a really good study, hopefully more often than not, that ends up being the consensus, and the findings that they're, really hanging their hat on turn out to be fairly reliable in generally speaking. So if you want to know if somebody knows their stuff about research, again, the best way to know if they're good at evaluating, interpreting research, and then disseminating those perspectives is, at the end of the day, what's their track record? Are they actually just good at that thing, right? So it's important to zoom in and not just say, well, if someone has a PhD, clearly they know all their stuff about research. Now, I will say, a PhD in theory tends to be, at least to some extent, a research-oriented degree. It is a good baseline indicator. Hey, all things being equal, if someone has a PhD and has published a bunch of research, I generally am going to assume that they kind of know what they're doing when it comes to research. But at the end of the day, if you taking their advice seriously is completely contingent on you believing that they are good at doing their own research, you need to actually dig into their research. If your opinion is absolutely tethered to the belief that they are good at in evaluating, interpreting, and relaying their views on research, then you need to go back and look at their track record and see, are they actually good at this stuff? When they call their shot, do they hit it out of the park, or do they strike out all the time, right? Now, whether or not your evaluation of their opinion should be tethered to those things is a fundamentally different question. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's really important to assess your own assumptions and biases when you're evaluating content creators and kind of deciding, am I critiquing the person or the argument? And sometimes you'll find that you're getting a little caught up in the credential without actually thinking, does that credential actually represent what I think it does? And then more importantly, what I think it's supposed to represent, does that actually matter to what I'm going to do with the information that they are putting out? Whether they're arguing with somebody or evaluating a study or giving a research program, it's really important to think through every step in that chain of assumptions to decide, how am I going to view and interpret the information coming my way? So moving on, how do we know if somebody is able to get themselves pretty jacked? That one's pretty easy. If they have at some point in their life been pretty jacked, I'm inclined to believe that they know how to get themselves pretty jacked. At least they knew it at some point, right? I don't think you need to stay in tip-top shape forever to have an opinion on fitness. I say that as a formerly very fit person who's in the worst shape of their life. So there's some motivated reasoning going on there. But at the end of the day, once you've climbed that mountain, you generally know the way back up. So yeah, if that is what you're tethering your perception to, if you're saying, I will not listen to someone unless I believe they can get themselves jacked, well, then you don't need a PhD to tell you whether or not that's the case. You can just figure out, has this person ever been really jacked? Now, how do we know if someone is able to get other people pretty jacked? Most straightforward way is that they have an established track record of helping people get pretty jacked, whether it's through their one-on-one coaching, programs they've made, content they've created, maybe apps they've created. So again, the whole idea here, the whole point of this is, when you're deciding whether or not to take someone's information seriously or apply it, you need to think through, what hurdle am I actually asking them to clear? Almost never is the question, well, unless they have a PhD, I'm not into it. More often than not, the question is, this person is interpreting a study they did not do. I would feel better if I believed that they were a very skilled researcher or an extremely well-versed interpreter of research. And so then you go and look into that. If they are creating a program and you're like, I have no interest in even opening this program until I've sufficiently convinced myself that they have a track record of making other people get really jacked, well, then go look into that. That's not what a PhD actually represents. Now, finally, this one's really tough. How do we know if someone is an excellent communicator or an excellent teacher/educator? I'll just say educator to keep it more concise. This is probably the hardest one because a lot of times we like to believe that whoever is the best communicator is necessarily the best educator in this space. And they're really fundamentally separate things. So if we're being like completely on the nose, very literal, really any person who draws a crowd and tends to have a large outsized influence on opinions is probably a pretty good communicator. They found a way to leverage what they got to communicate in a way that is clearly bringing people in the door and ultimately swaying their opinions. But then, of course, the big question is the information that they're communicating actually trustworthy? And in my opinion, that's kind of one of the big differences between a good communicator and a good educator. A good educator isn't just, a good communicator, like I said, can just get a lot of people interested, keep them on the hook, and convince them of things. But for them to also be a good educator means the things that they are convincing people of are true and useful, and the people that they are communicating to, if they're a good educator, are going to walk away with a high level of knowledge and the ability to actually apply that information. So if you've got a bunch of engaged followers and they believe what you say, then you're a good communicator. If your followers, whether that's a big or small group, know their stuff because of you, then you're a good educator. When you put that together, if you've got a huge audience of followers who know their stuff because of you, then you are a good educator and a good communicator. And so it's really important not to conflate those two things. There are people who are really good communicators in our space and in any space. There are people who are really good educators, and then there are a select few who are good at both. And they end up developing a huge audience of people who are highly educated and are, applying good information and ultimately having a lot of success because of it. So at the end of the day, how should we assess ideas and the people who form them in this crowded space of online fitness experts. I would argue that we should probably do it in a manner that is more similar to how researchers engage with other researchers. So a researcher, and I'm speaking from experience here, I've done a lot of collaborative papers. As a researcher, I'm never sitting down and saying, I really need a collaborator to make this paper work who has a very specific skill set. And then I find someone with that skill set and I say, oh, you only have a master's degree? Ugh, never mind. That is never the case. Similarly, I never sit down and say, I need this skill done that's going to really make this project work. The problem is I found someone who has that skill and they're perfect for it, but their PhD is in nutrition and I wanted someone with a PhD in exercise physiology. You would never do that. Same thing. I would never sit down and say, I really need someone and I found the right person, but the problem is their PhD comes from a university that's ranked 111th in America, and I really need someone from a top 10 university. It's just not how researchers view it. So when a researcher is looking for expertise, which is always how these collaborations form, they are purely focused on, I need to find someone who can deliver on the exact task or skill or subject matter area that I need here. And so I'm going to not look for who has the most prestigious degree or got their degree from the most prestigious program or who has more years of seniority. What I'm going to do is say, I'm going to go look into the research in that area and figure out who's doing the best stuff in this area. Who knows this better than anyone else? And so what I've found is that when researchers are engaging with other researchers, or when academics are engaging with other academics, one of the things you do is you get a really refined scope of the people I see in this broader network. Who seems to be a generalist, meaning they are pretty good at a wide range of topics and skills, versus who has a high level of expertise in a very narrow area of focus. It's always good to have a general idea of, this person has a lot of breadth across topics, but not a lot of depth in any individual one. This person has a tremendous amount of depth in this very niche topic or skill, but then outside of that, they're really not going to be super helpful. And as you're going through and figuring out, okay, what is this person's focal area? What is that person's focal area? Does that person have 3 topics on which they have pretty good knowledge? Or are they really a one-trick pony, which sometimes is the right person for the job? You have to go around and really get a sense of not just does this person have the right degree or the degree from the right school, but for what I am trying to get from this person in a collaborative sense, are they bringing to the table what I actually need? And so again, that's why I asked all those questions previously of, how do I know if someone is a good researcher? How do I know if they're good at interpreting research? How do I know if they are good at getting other people jacked? Usually those are the kind of questions that you're actually asking about your fitness professionals that make content in the space. And almost never is a PhD going to make or break that determination. There may be times where you say, hey, I just need someone who has a track record of making really great programs. And that person may not have a PhD. You might be saying, I want to get information on this topic from someone who knows this so much deeper than any other person in the world. Well, in that case, you're probably going to reach out not just for someone with a PhD, but someone who's published 6 papers on that topic. And so this comes up a lot in fitness, health, wellness, this whole space where, there are going to be people. I mean, so often I will kind of put a caveat where I'll say, hey, I am going to speak about a research-oriented topic that is uncomfortably outside of my scope of expertise. That is usually me kind of, in the cases where I say that, that's basically me saying, pretend that I'm taking this like PhD badge as if I'm like the sheriff of the town and putting it on the table. Okay, so please don't believe when I'm venturing out of my scope of expertise, and I know I am, please don't take these as the opinions of a PhD holder because I don't have one in this area, right? So it's just really important to think through very carefully when a person has a PhD, in what areas do I believe them to be a true expert? In what areas do I actually need them to be a true expert, and think very carefully about that. And so, like I was getting at with research collaborations, as a researcher, what we do is we try to get a good sense of what everybody's good at, where they have blind spots, where they have really novel expertise, really deep expertise. We use their track record. We cross-reference with people. If I'm looking into a debate about how collagen affects tendons, and I see two really qualified people disagreeing on it based on research, you better believe I'm going to start reaching out to people in my sphere who have expertise on that specific topic. I'm not just going to go around and look for anyone with a PhD or anyone who's a physical therapist, right? So it's just really important to be targeted about what do you really need to convince you to take someone's argument seriously, and how much weight are you actually placing on credentials, especially in scenarios where those credentials aren't even really pertinent to what you're leaning on them for. So I think kind of my broader point here is I think it's probably a good idea to ease off of the credentialism a little bit in general, and to think in a much more targeted fashion, not just I only listen to people with PhDs and they are inherently more qualified and give better information than people with master's degrees who are better than people who have bachelor's degrees. It's really just not an effective way to look at it. You should think more like a researcher and say, imagine I'm assembling a team of colleagues to do this research project. I need to not just look around for people with a credential. I need to look around for people who have a track record in being good at this specific thing. And a credential is very much a secondary thing. So just to put like a more direct example in the mix, right? Lane Norton has a PhD that was very focused on protein metabolism. He did a bunch of research with different protein sources, branched chain amino acids, things like that. So if you had a question about how much protein should I eat every day, I feel confident that you could go to me or Lane. We would both give you an answer. It may not be the same answer, but it'll be an answer that is highly compatible with the best evidence available, right? We may have some differences about, I lean a little lower, he leans a little higher. I don't know. But that's an area where, we both have a track record of making products that address that, making content that addresses that, getting deep into the evidence on that topic. You'd be fine going to either one of us. But if you had a very, very nitty-gritty question about protein metabolism, you probably want to go to him on that. Now, if you had a really nitty-gritty question about how metabolic rate changes, in response to energy restriction and exercise, which is like the focus of my research these days, I would hope that I'm a little bit more on the cutting edge of that specific topic. Now, it doesn't mean that I know nothing about protein metabolism. It doesn't mean that Lane knows nothing about those topics. I'm certain he does. But you get the idea that I'm getting at here, which is that it's really important to kind of get a sense. You get, as a consumer of information, you get to have a whole menu of folks that are out there creating content. You don't have to subscribe to, I'm completely behind this person for all topics. You get to actually sample and ask multiple people, and even sometimes encourage them to argue with each other and see which outcome you think is, or which case that you think is more persuasive after considering, the credentials of each person, the expertise of each person, the track record of each person. So it's important to recognize that it's great being the content consumer, because you get to assemble your team of experts to answer the question that is pertinent to you. So absolutely lean on more than just, do they have a PhD or not? And the other thing I wanted to bring up with Lane Norton before I got a little sidetracked there is, Lane Norton, again, his PhD was on protein metabolism. I think that's a fair kind of, in a nutshell, what it was on as a focal point. Would you feel comfortable using a powerlifting program or taking powerlifting programming advice from him? I would. He's got a track record of being very strong, helping other people get strong. As far as I can tell, again, getting back to like, what is your direct thing that you need to convince you to take this person's opinion or perspective seriously? I don't need him to have a PhD that's specifically focused on programming variables specifically for powerlifters. It'd be cool if he did, but at the end of the day, I've seen enough from his track record on the practical side to say it's worthwhile to take that opinion with or to take that perspective very seriously, right? And so that's why I was kind of getting at earlier all these questions of, well, if you really were of the opinion I only take powerlifting advice from someone with a PhD, it's important to recognize that Lane's PhD has nothing to do with his ability to help you put together a powerlifting program, but I'm still extremely confident that at the end of the day, he can very much help you put together a powerlifting program. And the reason that matters is because as it pertains to putting together a powerlifting program, he might as well not have a PhD, because that's just fundamentally not what it's in, right? Like he did his PhD purely in a nutrition department, not one of those like hybrid exercise and nutrition departments. It was a nutrition department under a supervisor who was an expert in protein metabolism, and the project was on protein metabolism. So again, if you're willing to take Lane's advice on powerlifting programming because he has a PhD, that makes fundamentally no sense, because his main, in my opinion, his most impressive credential that would lead you to take his powerlifting advice seriously is the fact that he's damn good at powerlifting, and he's been helping people get strong for a couple decades, right? So I think we need to break away a little bit from the credentialism and at the bare minimum, really contextualize what does this credential actually mean? And frankly, do I even care about that for the purposes of what I'm asking? So again, I have a PhD, and so it would behoove me to say you should only take advice from people with PhD, preferably if they're shorter than 5'10", for sure. They must have competed in natural body. It would make sense for me to want to say you need to create all these little, boundaries such that you only trust me and I'll never let you down. But at the end of the day, that's just not how I view it. So that's not directly helpful for people who are chomping at the bit to get to the bottom of this current dust up involving Solomon and Mike. I'm sure they will help you get to the bottom of that. They can handle that themselves. And I'm intrigued to get all the information before I kind of levy any opinion on it. But personally, in the interest of being like proactive and hopefully useful, I think it lends itself to a much broader question, which is, what do we make of these credentials? What do they represent? And more importantly, how do we actually go about finding information from the people we want our information from? And again, it's very impressive, that Lane has a PhD in protein metabolism. That PhD does not make him better at giving powerlifting advice, and yet I think he's a good person to get powerlifting advice from. So my kind of parting reiteration is, as you're going through and evaluating arguments that people make, there may be a case. The first line, obviously, the first thing you do when you're seeing someone make an argument or claim online is evaluate the argument or the claim itself. By far, that is the first thing you do. That's the most important thing you do. But only in instances where you are really befuddled and you're saying, man, I'm seeing this person make that argument, this person make a different one. I kind of want to compare whose word I'm giving more weight to. Of these two individuals, who do I really trust more? And if you find, well, this person has a PhD, but you look into it and it's in a topic that has nothing to do with the debate, this person over here maybe not have maybe they don't even have a degree in this area, but they're like coaching multiple world champions with the strategy that this question is about. Like, there's going to be times where the PhD is highly informative when you're trying to decide whose perspective am I going to give more weight to. But there are also going to be situations where it becomes fundamentally irrelevant because you find, oh, this person has a PhD, this person has a master's, this person is a practitioner with no such degree. But the topic they're arguing about has nothing to do with that person's PhD or that person's master's or even that practitioner's main focus of their practice. So at the end of the day, you have to lean more on a person's track record and the veracity of their argument itself more than getting too bogged down in the credential. All right, folks. Hopefully I didn't beat a dead horse too severely there. I hope that this was somewhat useful, at least in kind of giving you food for thought about, in this fitness space where there are so many arguments and debates, and it can be really challenging to figure out whose argument you should put more stock into. Hopefully this gave you kind of a mini template mentally of kind of thinking through, well, for this question, what would I really value as expertise? It may be a PhD, it may not be. And that'll kind of help you sort your way through those arguments. Because I will say, like, in the fitness space, it's relatively easier for me to kind of sort through two people disagree. Because this is an area I spend a lot of time, I can, critique the argument itself, look at the evidence that's relevant, and I can also kind of decide, of these two people, who do I feel like this is really more in their wheelhouse? But I deal with this all the time. I, believe it or not, do have interests and questions in life that extend beyond nutrition and lifting weights and energy expenditure. And I deal with the same annoyance when I go and I'm interested in getting an answer for something that is totally outside of the scope of anything I would pretend to have expertise about, just not even in the realm of health or fitness or anything like that. And I see two people who seem credible and they fundamentally disagree, and one of them must be wrong because the two people arguing, their ideas are absolutely mutually exclusive. So all the time I have to shake off that frustration and confusion and just get back to the basics and say, okay, I'm going to maybe search to see if there's a broader consensus on this. If one person is bucking the consensus, do I think they're making a legitimate argument? If so, do they have an established track record or some kind of background that would convince me that while the consensus is leaning this way, they are actually correct in pushing back the other way against that consensus? So this is a transferable kind of perspective and skill set of trying to get to the bottom of this stuff, that even when you feel really strong that you've developed expertise in one area and you think, oh, cool, I don't have to think through all this crap anymore, you're going to have questions in other areas anyway. So hopefully this was reasonably informative and insightful. I'm looking into the chat, and I see a very disappointed person here. Oh, my phone changed orientation. They said, no knee-jerk reaction and instantly condemning one camp or the other. How dare you? So I apologize severely for letting everyone down and not having a knee-jerk reaction. Again, I would refer you back to my entire online footprint for my entire life as to why anyone would expect otherwise. But no, I appreciate everyone who joined in on the live chat. As always, really appreciate the support for the Iron Culture. Because I failed to have a knee-jerk reaction, normally I would apologize and immediately resign. But since Helms doesn't show up anymore, then it would just be, I guess, a camera looking at a blank wall for about an hour and a half every Monday night. So I will postpone that shameful resignation, and at least until Helms gets back. Got a comment from Work Overtime Fitness, says, longtime listener, first time commenter. Thanks for all you do. Appreciate it very, very much. Like I said, thanks so much to everyone in the live chat. Once again, if you want to support people, if you're in a giving mood in this trying time in evidence-based fitness where everybody's yelling at each other, how about supporting the good folks over at Elite FTS and Dave Tate? Go to elitefts.com. Next time you need some lifting gear, maybe some lifting merch, use our code MRR10, Mass Research Review 10, for a 10% discount. In addition, if you want to support us very directly, make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review, share with a friend. And if you really love the show and you want to keep it alive and viable, consider becoming a member of the MASS community, the MASS Research Review. You can head over to massresearchreview.com to learn more about how to stay on top of that research every month. So everyone, thanks so much for joining me. Everyone have a fantastic week, and I will be back, I believe, with Helms in another 7 days.